Welcome to Impactful. Today we will talk about AI regulation with a special focus on sandboxes. Our guest is Katerina Yordanova, an ICT lawyer and lecturer. Welcome, Katerina.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
To start, I have a general question. What should we know about AI regulation?
Well, that's the question for $1 million, right? Because everyone now is talking about AI regulation, and we are in this very weird period that all around the globe we have states trying to regulate AIs, trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future, trying to actually regulate things before they happen, which is something very new for us as lawyers. And of course, lawyers are also lawmakers. This is new territory because usually how it goes is that you regulate things and relationship about technologies or whatever after they happen, and you watched how things developed, and then you see there's a problem, so you figure out that there should be a regulation. And of course, there is a time that passes. And now we are doing something completely on the different side of the scale. And now we are in this period all around the globe where we are regulating AI, both on state level, on interstate level, and even there are some attempts to have global regulations. How this is going to turn out, of course, we need some time to pass so we can evaluate and see, at least after maybe 5 years, see if what we do is in the correct direction or we need to change something.
Today we will talk about sandboxes. What are they and why are they so important?
Regulatory sandboxes, it's something very new comparatively because their existence began in 2014, so that's not that long ago. And as an instrument, you can say that they have a lot to do with what I just explained about this attempt of regulators and legislators to predict what's going to happen and have the insights, if it's AI or another technology, before it hits the market. So the regulatory sandboxes were seen largely as a way to do that. Because people who deal with computer science or have a bit of knowledge there, they know that what a sandbox is. It's a safe space that you can test your program or whatever. That's not going to affect your machine or your system. And this is a very, very useful instrument in the context of computers and these kind of technologies. But when we're talking about regulatory sandboxes, the principle is kind of the same. I know that a lot of people think that they are kind of a regulatory tool. I disagree with that because you don't really have the scale to think about regulatory sandboxes and be a regulatory tool. Yes, of course, you have this exchange of knowledge between regulators and the companies that test their products. That's a given, of course. That's part of the reason why we do it. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with regulatory sandboxes is to have this symbiotic relationship between regulators that get the knowledge, so they know how to do their job right. And then you have, of course, the innovators, those who have new innovative products and services, not only in the AI domain, but because now we're talking about AI, of course. And they actually want to get their product or services to the market as soon as possible, testing them with the regulator present so they know if there are potential legal risks and they can address them as early as possible, which of course brings them security in terms of that they know that they're compliant, because we know that legislation, especially in Europe, but not only, if you breach it, there are very hefty fines that need to be paid. Obviously, everyone wants to avoid that. And so this symbiotic relationship's in the core of the sandboxes.
Can you give an example of a sandbox?
Yes, of course. That's something that I very often figure out that people do not really understand what it is. And of course, they don't have to. That's why it's good that we have Google, but also people who need to talk about those specific tools and explain them a bit more clearly. And that's why usually when I try to give an example, I start with the first sandbox that we have, first functioning one. And this is it's still running in the UK. This is the FCA, so the Financial Conduct Authority. They created the first sandbox. And that's, of course, very logical because, as I said, sandbox started to be a thing in 2014. So that was around the time when the fintech was really booming. And it was like a core technology / regulatory problem and challenge. And then, of course, in the UK, where the market is, very saturated with new technologies and new services in the financial sector that are offered all the time. So the regulator in the financial sector, they decided that they want to have this relationship with the innovators so they can learn. And of course, the innovators can feel more secure about their products and they can get to the market quicker. So what they did was create this, I call it a tool, but as a matter of fact, it's more of a process in a way, because you have a few stages that the sandbox consists of. And then you have first the application process, of course. You have the selection process. Then you have with the selected candidates, the regulator develop testing process. So basically figure out what do they want to test the technology for. And of course, what are the tests that they need to do. And then they have the testing itself that goes with, constant discussions with the regulators as well after every step, if you wish. And the end of the testing, which is basically, in most cases, the regulator gives the green light for the innovator to go to market. So that's in a nutshell how a sandbox looks like. It's a tool, but at the same time, it's a process. It's tool, I guess, for the regulator. For the innovator, it's mostly a process that they need to get through. Well, they don't need to, but of course, if they want to, and they are selected, they can go through. And the end goal was to hit the market quicker and safer.
How are sandboxes regulated?
Usually, up until this point, they were regulated very loosely. Basically, of course, you have the regulator being the FCA, as I gave as an example, or another one, that needs to have the capability of first creating the sandboxes. So in terms of, if you're talking about how they're regulated, the most important thing is that the regulator have the mandate to create those sandboxes. And this is a very key thing, especially for states that have a more complicated structures, like let's say Belgium, where I'm based, because we have regions that have very different and separated competencies. This is a bit of a challenge for those states. And another thing is that some states, they actually have acts laws that regulate regulatory sandboxes and test beds and this kind of experimental places and spaces like in both. But this is not something that's very common. Usually the idea was that if the regulator has the mandate to create such a space, they kind of determine on their own how it's supposed to look like, how their procedures are going to work, and so on. But now with the AI Act, it's actually that we are having a step in a different direction. It's not only the AI Act, as a matter of fact. For example, the Interoperable Europe Act, which was adopted before the AI Act, also has a section on the sandboxes. The difference with the AI Act being that they are not mandatory for the member states, but still there were a lot of provisions that actually show how a sandbox should look like. And in the AI Act, the regulatory sandboxes, as I mentioned, they're obligatory for the member states to have at least one or participate in one. It could be like a cross-border project. And then in the regulation itself, they are described. There is a legal definition and their aims and the goals. They're regulated in a way. But what we are actually expecting, because I would say that they're in a higher level, so it's not that detailed in terms of like crucial details. For example, what are the entrance criteria? Or maybe that would be left for the member states. So there is an implementation act that's going to be adopted by the Commission. I suppose at some point, maybe the second half or before the summer, not sure. But then with the Implementation Act, we are going to have better details or like more in-depth details on how the sandboxes should look like. So as you see, the premises is changing, at least in Europe. And they are now a bit more regulated.
What is the current state when we talk about sandboxes in general, worldwide?
Well, as I mentioned in the previous question, the sandboxes in Europe, especially for the AI, they are very much at the center of the discussion. So we are waiting for the Implementation Act. And in parallel, of course, most member states already started different processes of preparation and establishment of regulatory sandboxes, because we can't really wait for the implementation act. Then you're going to have very little time to prepare, because, as I said, it's an obligation and they need to be operational by the time that the AI Act becomes applicable. So in this particular case, 2 years after it entered into force. And of course, that requires, it's a state-run initiative that requires time. And that's why now I think that most member states started some sort of initiative, either preparation of reports on how it's supposed to be built, how it could be built, what's the best option for the particular state, and so on. Or some of them actually already try to create this environment based on other sandboxes that they may already have. So in Europe, at least, it's a very dynamic picture. And we have them everywhere, from Africa to Asia. Of course, Singapore is a very good example, South Korea as well. In the States, they don't really call them that much regulatory sandboxes. They talk mostly about test beds with participation of regulators. So there's a bit of a subtle difference. But other countries like Brazil, for example, they also have already started their work on creating regulatory sandboxes for AI. In their case. So every country is definitely trying to get into the sandbox train, if you wish. And we'll see how this goes and which model is the most successful at the end of the day.
How are European countries preparing for regulatory sandboxes, and what challenges do they face?
Some countries have different structures than others, obviously. And I mentioned Belgium, for example, but Germany is also another such example. They have a federal structure, and of course, federal level is responsible for one thing, and then you have the lower level that's responsible for other. Sometimes, because the sandbox is kind of a complicated matter, you have two conflicting matters that belong to different levels. And that's something that's, it sounds technical, but at the end of the day, you need to solve it from your legal perspective, because you can't do it and just disregard the constitution, right? So that's quite a big challenge. And then you have the monetary challenge, obviously, because sandboxes are expensive. And especially when we're talking about AI sandboxes, I think that they're particularly expensive. And I'll say why. Because what we had up until this moment was a bit of a different model. With the fintech, you have the financial regulator, and then you have innovation in the financial sector. And this innovation can be different, of course. Blockchain, very popular in the financial sector, AI as well. And other technologies, or combination of them, it was like technology neutral in a way. The important thing was that it was happening in the financial sector, and the financial regulator was responsible for the financial sector. But with the AI, because we're talking about AI sandboxes, the parameters are different, because you can have AI applications, product, services in the medical sector, and then another one in the financial sector, and the third one in the energy sector. And the regulators for these sectors, they are different, right? And then first you need to figure out how those regulators are going to talk together, how they're going to test together, what they're going to test, what's the leading thing of testing. So if you have a conflict, like if you have a feature in the product or service that suffice with the sectorial, like energy sectorial requirements, but at the same time kind of breaches privacy or the AI Act provision, what do you do then? How do you solve this kind of conflict? And this, of course, because you have so many experts and so many regulators participating, means that first you need to have the resources of those to be able to dedicate, and second, it's expensive. That's why some countries, as smaller member states that do not have so many resources, they started like a bit of a different approach, and I'll give the example with Bulgaria. So there, what's happening in the moment is bottom-up approach. It's very different, but it was very pragmatic as well. So what they decided to do, and I actually participated in consulting them as an external consultant. I really love the project. Is that you have this public institute that's dedicated to AI. So they have the infrastructure for testing, because they were adamant that there is no point of creating a sandbox without the physical testing facilities. And then they're trying to develop, they call it for now policy lab, but the idea is to get the regulators and become a sandbox at some point, where they're going to offer the testing capacities and the expertise from there. Of course, it's a public institution, so there is not really that much conflict of interest of any kind. And it's going to be like a sandbox as a service, which is very unique, but at the same time, it saves a lot of money. So if the AI authority and the privacy authority, for example, they decide they have a co-own, this cohort is going to be dedicated for privacy, AI privacy preservation or privacy sensitive technology, products or services. They decide to just go cooperate with this public institution, and they kind of split the expenses in a way and use the infrastructure, the testing protocols and everything, and they just bring the legal and regulatory expertise mostly. So this is another model, but it's basically inspired by trying to save resources and use what we already have, because in Europe we have a lot of things, but sometimes I feel that we don't use them that's often. Like we create them for one purpose and then we just disregard them when we can repurpose them or just slightly change something and use them for something else and really save resources, which is, I think, pretty cool. And other challenges that, of course, are faced is that in Europe, one of the things that are very common for the sandboxes, and that's this exclusion from certain rules, which obviously is attractive for companies. That's very hard to do. And it's usually because a lot of those rules in the regulated industries, they come from EU level. So, of course, the national regulator cannot just say, okay, this rule we don't apply because it's an European rule. You don't have the power to do that. And so that's a big problem, because then if you don't offer this leeway from certain requirements, then you have one less way to attract these innovative companies to test with you. So then I, of course, have ideas of other types of incentives, but so far I haven't seen really that many alternatives just officially made official.
What motivated you to choose this topic for research?
It was a side research line. I started in 2019, I think. So I wrote this blog post because I saw the term somewhere. I was kind of interested because I like this kind of creative usage of multidisciplinary terms. And then I started familiarizing myself with the concept, and I found it very pragmatic and interesting because, as I said, it brings a very different way of regulating compared to what we traditionally have. So it was a side interest for quite a while. That was even before we were talking about AI sandboxes. It was before the AI Act. And as a matter of fact, at some point, because of many circumstances that just occurred in my life, it became kind of a main topic. But what really drove me was the pragmatism and logic behind it, because it's a simple thing, but it's effective, and it's something new as an approach, very original.
Did you discover anything very interesting or important?
Well, because I'm a legal researcher, right? So one would think that I discovered something that's legally related, and there are a lot of interesting things, of course, there. But for example, that legal certainty as a concept is not that certain, which was a kind of a surprise for me. But honestly, it really is not, because if you ask a lawyer, do you know what legal certainty is? They are going to be quite offended and then say, yeah, of course, that's something we learned first year. But then when you ask them to define it, and then they start backtracking a bit because they're not exactly certain what legal certainty is. And it really turned out that's not that certain. But yeah, that's interesting for lawyers, I guess. But what I found very interesting for more like broader spectrum of people was that we kind of, especially in Europe, started to this tendency of creating problems and answers of problems that do not exist. And at the same time, we are trying to disregard very simple solutions of actual problems. So I would say that, without spoiling, of course, the end of my thesis, that's one of my main recommendations would be that we really need to concentrate on answering real needs and real problems, because it's not that we are lacking problems. That's definitely not something that's in shortage. But yeah, so if you find something that very cool as a solution, it's like, that sounds amazing. Now, what kind of problem it solves? And then you start figuring out that some imaginary problem, that's not the good approach.
When discussing sandboxes and regulation, it is important to mention the European AI Act.
Well, I am a very, very harsh critic of the AI Act. Just want to say as a remark. And my main problem with it is not even that much the content. I mean, I have problems with the content as well, but my main issue is that it's written in a very peculiar way. And by peculiar, I mean that we lawyers, I often joke that law is a bit like coding. And it's because it's a kind of a separate language. And we as lawyers in our national systems, but also internationally, we know this code. So something that for someone like who's not a lawyer means one thing, for us means something else. I usually like to give the example with privacy. Privacy, of course, for computer scientists, for people who work with it from technical point of view, means one thing. For us as lawyers, privacy it's a fundamental right, and yes, they at the end of the day, the idea behind them is kind of the same, but what they mean operationally, it's different. Often, when we're working with clients who are in tech sector, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and it's the same with the AI Act. The way that it's written is atrocious. First of all, second of all, the way that it uses words that we need to interpret, because at the end of the day, the lawyers are going to be the people who are going to interpret it. It's going to be the courts. It's going to be the regulators. We need to understand it. If we don't understand it, then we have a big problem. And if you write it in a way that we don't recognize our codes, then you start to first, they kind of kick you out of your comfort zone, which is not good. And then, not good in this particular case. And then you start to be creative about it. But creativity, it's a good thing also, but not when we're talking about laws. Because if you get creative with the laws, then you compromise legal certainty. And then the other members of society don't know what to expect. And that's the problem. So that's why I really criticize the way that the AI Act is written, the terms that are used inside, the way that it's the sentences are composed, and most of all, I already started comparing different versions, different language versions, and for I don't know if this is a common knowledge, but in EU law, every single version has the same power. So the Bulgarian version has the same power as the French version. They are all official. But obviously, the any act, is not written in all the languages at the same time. It's written on French and English top, and then they translate it. But the translation, it has problems. And I already compared the English and the Bulgarian version, and they're really weird things there. Like words that do not mean the same thing. And I'm quite certain that if I compare it with other versions, especially those of the member states that are smaller, so obviously the language is a bit harder to grasp, there's going to be a lot of issues, and that creates uncertainty.
How do regulatory sandboxes manage data protection?
According to the AI Act, there is actually a whole provision that's dedicated to data protection. The core principle obviously stays the same. I mean, all the data protection rules that we have from GDPR, they apply as well. And during the testing, of course, the regulator and the companies, they need to be sure if they use real data, like personal data. They cannot just disregard those rules, even though it's a testing, even though it's in the sandbox. But this is a kind of an incentive that was actually offered by the AI Act, is that during the testing, it is possible for certain personal data that was unlawfully collected for one purpose to be used for another purpose without asking again the data subject. That, of course, is subject to quite a lot of additional requirements. For example, if it's if we're talking about a product or service that's kind of for the public good and all other things. It's like, I think, like 13 additional conditions. So at the end of the day, if you kind of try to satisfy all of them because they need to be satisfied at the same time, that's almost like impossible to actually use this incentive, but it is there, so it is usable.
What are the biggest AI risks that are not talked about enough?
I think that everyone talks about risks nowadays about the AI. And I don't know, it's kind of hard because, with all the algorithms in social media, it's kind of hard to really get a good grasp what is talked about and what is in your echo chamber. So it is very hard to get the real picture of what is really mainstream, what is not. And of course, we have all the risks that are connected to using AI for autonomous weapons. That's I don't know if it's a risk. I mean, it's a reality. Like, why should we kill ourselves? It's already happening. We saw it. So yeah, that's definitely a risk. But if we're talking about something that's kind of swept under the rug, I think maybe the environmental aspect is very much it's talked about, but it's not the center of the discussion. And especially with generative AI now that everyone is using it, including some people using ChatGPT and similar tools as kind of a Google search. I don't think that people kind of realize how much energy and resources go with just one simple use of these instruments. And this is very problematic because it's not only energy, or it is energy. I mean, I think that last week I read that now we're talking about using nuclear power to actually supply those data centers because that's how extreme the demand is. And then, of course, it also requires water, for example. That's quite a big problem, especially for those data centers that are built in developing countries, where sometimes, especially with the global warming, water is becoming really scarce, and you don't really have that much in terms of resources that you can use without affecting the population. So this is something that I really like to stress about. And obviously, of course, you have all this, I don't know if it's a theory, but about killing creativity, killing the job market, all these talks. I can't say that's going to happen. I would say that probably it won't happen. But yes, definitely the creativity is something that can suffer. And not because the generative AI is creative. Of course, it's not. Like, I just don't understand. Maybe I suck at writing prompt. I don't see anything creative in that. At the end of the day, it's a statistics too. It gives you the most common answer, and if that's what you think, then you're not very creative, I might say. Obviously, I know that may sound a bit weird, but what really is the danger here is that you rely a bit too much on those tools, and that's going to really, in the long run, create problems in terms of you're not going to be as inclined to put efforts into tasks, and that's a problem because it's going to lower the quality of everything, services, products, everything. But I wouldn't say that it's going to kill the job market. That's not how it's going to happen.
Thank you, Katerina. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
You watched another episode of Impactful. Thank you, and see you next week.